Hey readers, it's so great to see you back here for another Read Aloud. We are still in our biography unit, and so today I chose a biography. This is called 5 Brilliant Scientists. This is from the Great Black Heroes series. And so it's separated into 5 chapters. I probably won't read all 5 today because with the writing and everything, the videos get a little long, but we'll see how much we can get done. So I have my book. I have my reader's notebook. I have a pen to keep track of my thinking. I have some sticky notes around here somewhere, but I can't see them. And so let me take a look at the informational reading progression to write down some skills I want to focus on. Informational reading progression. And you know, I have something in mind because something I've been practicing is an analytic skill, which I thought about doing analyzing author's craft. So I might keep that in the back of my mind in case I notice something that the author does that like really stands out. But I want to practice growing my skills today, growing my ideas. I don't just want to summarize. I want to grow my own ideas. So I might ask a question and try to answer it, or I'll just think beyond just summarizing, okay? So that's what I'm going to work on today. Critical reading, growing ideas, and maybe a little bit of analyzing. So I've written the date, I've written the title, the author, and my 2 skills that I'm going to focus on: critical reading, growing ideas, and analyzing author's craft. Okay, here we go. So actually, I guess I forgot to explain. I picked this book because I've been watching a TV show that's set in the past. It's kind of like a historical fiction kind of show. And so I was thinking, you know, I'm kind of getting more interested in that. I've started like talking old-timey in my head. And so I was like, I'm going to pick something from that, like for a historical biography. And that's a tip to you readers. If you're looking for something next, think about the kind of TV shows you like to watch or the type of movies you like to watch, and then try to find a genre that's similar to that, right? If you like watching fantasy movies and shows, try reading a fantasy book. Or if you like watching really action, superhero kind of stuff, find a book that has that. Because there's a lot of crossover in genres in TV shows and movies with genres of books you can find. So, history. We're going to start with someone you might have heard of, George Washington Carver. He is a really world-famous agricultural scientist. Let's read to find out what that means. On a cold, dark night in 1864, a gang of masked white men burst into a slave cabin near Diamond Creek, Missouri. They surrounded a baby named George and his mother, Mary Carver. "Please don't hurt my baby," cried Mary, as she held the sickly boy in her arms. The men ignored her. They were slave raiders. They kidnapped the slaves and sold them in different states. The gang snatched Mary, and George rode off into the night. Sorry, I read that wrong. The gang snatched Mary and George and rode off into the night. Moses Carver, a white slave owner, owned Mary, George, and Jim, George's older brother. Moses sent a man to search for Mary and George. The man found the cold and sick baby boy, but George and Jim never saw their mother again. Moses and his wife, Susan, raised and cared for the boys. The more George grew, the more curious he became. Young George spent a lot of time outdoors looking at plants. How do flowers get their color? George wondered. What makes plants grow? This curiosity later helped George Washington Carver become a world-famous agricultural scientist. Okay, so I'm having a lot of thoughts swirling around in my head. First, the author gives us a big, first sentence. It's 1864, right? So they're telling us the setting. We know it's like way, way in the past. It sets up a lot of the setting with talking about how there's slave raiders, I believe they called them. And So I want to write that. I want to just identify the setting. That's always important when you're reading. And then also, I'm having this thought of like, I didn't read it in here. The author didn't come right out and say it, but I'm assuming George Carver, maybe had a tough childhood. I'm just trying to imagine what that might be like, to not know your mom or dad and never really see them again after your baby. So I'm going to write some of those notes now. Okay, so I've written on page 14, just my growing ideas goal. Just a thought I had on my own was, I'm thinking George Washington Carver had a tough childhood maybe. The author doesn't say it in an obvious way, but I'm guessing it because George Washington Carver didn't know his birth parents, right? And I added this part, birth parents, because it does say that Moses Carver and Susan raised and cared for the boys. So it does seem like they were kind of adopted and cared for. So maybe they would consider them their adoptive parents, which are also like parents. So birth parents, just kind of separate that out. Okay, after writing that note and kind of rereading that sentence that Moses and his wife Susan raised and cared for the boys, now I'm rethinking my theory because I was thinking they had a hard childhood, but then I was like, well, they have these two people that cared for them, which is the power of rereading, right? You might revise your theory by reading just one sentence over again. Anyway, let's keep reading and I'll figure it out. Young George was very smart. He grew all sorts of plants in his garden. If they were dying, he made them healthy and strong. George sure has a way with plants, everyone said. They called him the plant doctor. And the caption here says, young George spent a lot of time outdoors caring for plants. When George turned 12, he left home to go to school. Though slavery had ended in 1865, many schools would not accept blacks. So George traveled all over Kansas to find black schools. Kind families took him in while he studied. He washed clothes and cooked to earn his keep. In 1886, George graduated from Minneapolis High School in Minneapolis. In Minneapolis, Kansas. He was 22 years old. The next year, George was accepted to study at Simpson College in Indianola, Iowa. George studied art at Simpson, but he was still curious about plant life. So in 1891, he went to Iowa State College of Agriculture in Ames, Iowa. There, George studied plants and farming. He graduated in 1894. He was soon to be Instructor Carver. There he is. There's a caption here. At Simpson College, young Henry A. Wallace took walks with George Washington Carver and learned all about plants and flowers. Wallace later became the Secretary of Agriculture for the United States. So I'm noticing some author's craft here, crafting techniques, and that is, we're noticing under these illustrations, captions. Now, captions are a normal thing we see in books, right? Especially nonfiction books. But usually we see captions under photographs or under real pictures of things. And so I just think it's interesting when it's a biography, like a narrative kind of informational text. I would just expect to see illustrations that go along with the words, like in a normal narrative story. But here, under each of these illustrations, the author chose to put captions. That's teaching us even more about George Washington Carver's life. I'm going to add that to my notebook of something I noticed about the author's craft. Okay, so I just wrote my skill analyzing author's craft. Well, the author puts captions to go with the illustrations. I'm used to seeing captions with photographs. Then I added a thing that I think the author did this because she wants to teach us more. So sometimes we just notice the author's craft, but when we actually analyze it, we put in this part of why we think the author did this. So that's why I added that bit. I also wanted to mention I'm noticing a lot of errors in my fluency. I'm mixing up a lot of words. I'm reading the numbers wrong. And whenever I do that, it makes me realize that I'm not really giving my full attention to what I'm reading. And I don't know if you've ever noticed that happen to you before. So I'm just gonna remind myself that if I want to read with good fluency, I have to really give 100% of my focus to the book. So I'm gonna set an intention to do that for the rest of this read aloud. For a while, he taught at the college and he took care of the greenhouse. He continued to do experiments with plants and he discovered cures for plant diseases. He was encouraged by the Wallaces, a prominent family in the community. One day, George received an important letter from Booker T. Washington. He was the head of Tuskegee Institute, an all-black college in Tuskegee, Alabama. "Would you please come and teach at our school?" asked Booker T. Washington. George happily accepted the invitation for the job of professor. In 1896, he arrived at the Institute. Cotton farms surrounded Tuskegee. After years of planting cotton, the soil was worn out. The farmers were having problems growing their cotton crop. Insects ate up all the cotton that did grow. Without cotton, farmers couldn't make a decent living. George was able to help. He taught his students how to make the soil healthy, and he taught the farmers too. "We need to put good things like peanuts into the soil," said George. "Peanuts are healthy, and they taste good too." The farmers planted peanuts, and just as George said, the soil became healthy. The peanuts grew and grew. Soon there were too many peanuts. "What are we going to do with all these peanuts?" asked the farmers. George wasn't sure, so he did many experiments. He found that he could make many things from peanuts. He made oil, soap, and butter. In total, he made over 300 products from peanuts. Wow, that is a lot of stuff. So I feel like I've read a lot and I want to just keep track of some of these things. And as I kept reading the dates, I realized, you know what I could do to keep track of these things I'm learning? Make a timeline. So I'm going to look for these dates again, and I'm even going to scan. This is the last page here. So he died on 1943. So I'm going to make my timeline cover the span of his life, which 1864 to 1943. Okay, I'm going to do that now. Okay, so I've created my timeline here in my notebook, and it goes, you saw me kind of mess around with the dates a little bit to get some pretty even spacing. It's not perfect, but that's okay, because it's my reader's notebook, and it's just for my own notes. So I put in the date when he was born. There was another important date when slavery ended, when he graduated high school, when he went to college, and when he moved to Alabama and worked at Tuskegee University. Then I put in the date when he died. So what I'm going to read next is going to tell me all this middle part. I also want to add a little bit about kind of just his life so far and what I'm thinking about the things he did. Okay, so I've just written here something that I was thinking, growing ideas. It seems like George Washington Carver was very motivated to work hard and do good things. He wanted to develop a solution for the farmers so they could have healthy crops. So that's just something I'm thinking in my own brain. Okay, back to reading. So thinking about my fluency, that last section I read, I still made a few errors. They were less, but they're still there. So I'm just going to tell myself again in a kind way. I'm not going to be mean to myself, but just kind of give myself a pep talk. Come on, Caitlin, you can do this. Just focus. Okay, thanks. Okay. Professor Carver's research helped change the way farmers planted their crops all over the South. He was invited to speak about his work with peanuts to the United States Congress. The professor studied other crops too. He made 118 products from sweet potatoes, flour, starch, and rubber, to name a few. Because of his research, sweet potatoes and peanuts became the biggest selling crops in the South. Soon, George was written about in newspapers everywhere. Colleges invited him to speak. People sent him money for research. Important businessmen, such as Henry Ford, who designed cars, and Thomas Edison, a famous inventor, offered him jobs. But George did not want to take the jobs. He wanted to teach. George continued to teach until he was very old. Professor George Washington Carver died on January 5th, 1943. He had taught at the Tuskegee Institute for 47 years. Then there's another image here from when he was older. There it is. With the caption, Dr. Carver helped to make soil healthy by growing peanuts. And there's also a table here. Here. With products made from peanuts. Cool. Okay. I'm having some thoughts, especially about that teaching part, because I do have a connection to that. So I'm going to write my ideas that I'm growing in my notebook. And yeah. Okay, so I've just written down, George Washington Carver was a dedicated teacher. He had job offers from very famous people, but turned them down to keep teaching at Tuskegee. I connect to this because I also love being a teacher. Okay, so I also want to add this to my book list because I think this is all I'm going to read out of it today. I think I'm going to give it a 3 out of 5. It was kind of short. Oops. It was an interesting story, and I liked the crafting techniques of putting captions with illustrations. I thought that was interesting. Maybe I like that more just because I stopped to think about it. But yeah, 3 out of 5. Pretty cool. So I honestly thought that I was going to read probably at least 2, maybe 3 chapters out of this book. But it turns out I had a lot of thinking and a lot of jotting, a lot of writing that I needed to do. Just reading about George Washington Carver. So this is where I'm going to end it today. The video is getting quite long. But I will make another one. We'll read another story out of this because I think it just has such great information, and it's interesting to think about the lives of people who lived in such a different time than we did, which is why it's sometimes fun reading historical biographies, just to kind of get into the world of the past. If you have any suggestions or books that you would like to hear, please let me know. I'm more than happy to make some recordings of suggested books. So just drop me a line. And happy reading, everyone. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I can't wait to read to you again. Bye.